Our panel's job is to talk about some of the more pressing challenges, is specifically safe drinking water, especially in rural communities. And it reflects both quality and quantity issues. You've heard earlier today that there are many areas during the drought that lost their supply completely, not just water quality problems. So we need to also then talk about the longer term challenges. So we've got high priorities in terms of challenges like drinking water, and then the longer challenges of nitrates and especially salts. So we're going to try and cover that ground. But probably the most important aspect of it is how do we coordinate these things? How do you manage water quality and supply at the same time, especially in view of the recommendations and or notion of using a lot more groundwater recharge to help us with our sustainability issues. So how do those things fit together? It's going to take a lot more coordination. And our panel today is going to talk about their respective areas in terms of some of those goals. And because it's probably the most challenging one and the most pressing, the first speaker is going to be Veronica Garibay. She's going to talk about the issue with the small system drinking waters, and also, though, how they feel in the environmental justice community about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Salt and Nutrient or Nitrate Control Program. So, Veronica, the question for you is, what are the most important next steps to provide valley communities with safe drinking water? And what should then be their longer term priorities as well?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. While I'm sitting here, there are hundreds of community leaders who could have talked about the need for safe and affordable drinking water in the San Joaquin Valley today, and a lot of our partner organizations like Self-Help Enterprises and Community Water Center, who we work very closely with on these issues. I'd like to start by saying that it's no secret that more than 1 million Californians don't have access to safe drinking water today. That's the reality that we live in, and that doesn't account for the thousands of families reliant on domestic wells or on receiving water from state small water systems, which we don't have sufficient and good water quality data and haven't yet figured out how to properly account and test and make sure that we're providing resources for those communities who are heavily impacted. We also know that there's a triple penalty that disadvantaged communities face when confronted with a lack of affordable drinking water, and those are having to pay for their water bill. Even though you can't drink it, you still have to pay for it, and many are paying upwards of $50 to $80 per month for water that they can't drink. Families are also forced to purchase bottled water to replace what they can't drink from their tap, and then there are health costs associated with short and long-term exposure to contamination. And there are a lot of urgent priorities, and I'll sort of break them down pretty quickly. But the first one is, and many of you know, as it's as our governor just said in his first 4 days in office, it's a disgrace that in California there are 1 million people without safe drinking water. And many of you know or might know that there is a historic effort to establish the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund at the state level that would provide a permanent source of funding for ongoing operation and maintenance costs of treating contamination in disadvantaged communities, as well as providing capital for infrastructure projects, consolidation projects, addressing high-risk areas for families reliant on domestic wells and state small systems, and really working together with stakeholders, including the ag and dairy community, and environmental justice leaders and environment leaders around the state to come together for a solution. And we ask all of you to support it. We shouldn't continue to look the other way when we know that today there are families who can't turn on their tap and cook with the water that's coming out of their kitchen. Other issues to address long-term priorities and how do we make sure we address the issue and the previous panel talked a little bit about this, which is local cities and counties playing a larger role in land use and water management and making sure that we're taking a proactive approach to planning and investment and being real partners to communities in that space. Sigma, it's huge, it's a topic of today as we work to develop groundwater sustainability plans. We have to make sure that disadvantaged communities and those most vulnerable to water scarcity are playing a front and center role. We have to democratize decision-making when it comes to water. We have made a commitment as an organization to work with various stakeholders to make sure that community voices are part of the process and are included in decision-making when it comes to water. It's something that we all need to survive off of, so naturally makes sense to make sure that there are various stakeholders involved. And further protection from groundwater contamination is key. We have worked with folks on the stage today and in the audience to engage in the CV salts process for over a decade, and have made that commitment to come to the table with ag, dairy, and other leaders to identify those solutions that are tough to get to, but we have made that commitment to do that. And finally, there are other tools for securing safe drinking water, such as consolidation. The state just got the authority to appoint administrators for small water systems that can't supply drinking water. So those are a few things that I'd point to as both short and long term.
Well, just a little follow-up then. Are you more comfortable then that the Sigma process is being adequately run in terms of representation from the environmental justice and disadvantaged communities? Yes? Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I'd like to add a little more context to that. I think it's a new process. Everybody's learning. It's complex. There's a lot of technical detail, as the previous panel talked about, associated with a lot of that. We, as an organization, we are monitoring 16 GSAs in the San Joaquin Valley, led by my colleague Amanda Monaco, who's here with me today. If you haven't known her, get to know her. There's always opportunities to do more and do better in certain aspects, but I would like to point to some good models that are coming from the ground, that are going from the ground up to make sure that disadvantaged communities are a part of the process, and those include the North Fork Kings Rural Advisory Committee, Rural Communities Advisory Committee that they've developed to give a voice to disadvantaged communities in that process that directly feeds and informs GSP development. The other practice that we've seen work well is most recently the Merced Sub-Basin GSA and the Madera County GSA have really encouraged all stakeholders to talk to one another and work together to identify solutions and learn from one another. Oftentimes we find ourselves in a room where we may have not realized or truly understood challenges that are facing different sectors and different stakeholders very differently. But with that said, we are a willing partner, as are organizations like Self-Help Enterprises and Community Water Center, to work directly with the GSAs to make sure that disadvantaged communities are involved, and that we're creating processes and systems that will maintain that level of engagement in the implementation phase.
Excellent, thank you. David, I know you've been involved in CVC salts for quite some time, so I think you probably need to give people a little bit of a background of the core elements of it, but I think where we are now is that we're ready to fully implement it and its parts and pieces. And there's two, obviously. The more short-term one is the nitrate issue, which gets back to what Veronica was just talking about. How can we develop safe drinking water in the impacted communities? And so the question to you is how do you see this gearing up, that particular element? And then in terms of the long-term process with the salt control, that's a longer-term process. And so if you can outline that a little bit so that everybody understands, much like the glide path that we're seeing in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, attaining salt sustainability is not going to be a short-term issue either. So if you could, number one, on how do you see it unpackaging for fixing groundwater in terms of drinking water, and then where do we go on the long-term salt issue?
Okay, thank you very much, George, for the question. CV salts, it's a long process. It's been going on for over 10 years, sort of Carl Longley, who's in the room here somewhere, really started this process in trying to get us on the road with this effort and help from the state board. It's been a long process, arduous at times, many long meetings, but we came out with something I think is a really good product in the end. Initially, when we started off, we were really looking primarily, at least in my mind, primarily at salts and figuring out how to come up with a salt balance in the Central Valley. Soon after we started, we realized that there's this nitrate issues that we really needed to deal with, and it was much more pressing, had human health impacts, and so we really diverted a lot of our attention focusing on the nitrate control program and away from the salinity side of it. We had, sitting around the table with your, your colleagues, with Leadership Council, with the Community Water Center, other environmental justice folks, as well as the regional board and state board members and representatives from all types of industry across the state, agriculture, wastewater treatment plants, dairy, food processors, anybody who has anything to do with nitrates and salts were at the table. And what we realized is that we all had individual problems. I mean, from the environmental justice community and those impacted by drinking water, they didn't have water that they could drink. It's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. And it's taken far too long to start really implementing solutions to that problem. From the regulated entity standpoint, we had some real regulatory problems that were set up a long time ago from policies that were adopted back in the 80s and the 60s that were being applied to us today in the groundwater context. And not to bore you too much with the nuances of it, but from the regulated community, there were a lot of us, including in agriculture, that really the regional board didn't have the ability to permit us to continue to farm. There was no regulatory pathway that they could allow us to continue to farm. One of the things with production agriculture and other industries as well, including POTWs and dairy, but I'll focus a little bit more on specifically on ag. In most areas, you're not going to be able to farm a viable crop and not leach nitrates past the root zone above 10 milligrams per liter. In areas that the water quality is above the objective, regional board, under current regulations, prohibited from allowing that discharge to occur, which basically means you can't irrigate. There's this process in irrigation, you got to push your salts down, you got to try and keep your nitrates in the root zone, so there's sort of conflicting issues we're dealing with. But we had a real major regulatory problem to deal with as well. So the big picture deal that we made is if we fix the drinking water problem, basically stand up as a group, as a community, all of the regulated community, with the environmental justice community and say, look, we'll help fund this, we'll come up with projects to solve the immediate drinking water problem in exchange for a little bit of regulatory flexibility to not require, but allow the regional board to permit activities on the ground, like agriculture, like other activities, to continue, so long as you're doing the right thing, doing the best you can, and you're fixing the drinking water problem up front. That was sort of the big picture deal. We put that package together. It's gone to the regional board, been approved by the regional board, and it's currently sitting in front of the state board. I think that was adopted in May, the end of May of last year. We're hoping that that's going to get on the state board's agenda very soon so that we can get on and actually full-scale implement the nitrate control program and work on the salt side of it. I do want to point out that we're not sitting on our hands waiting for the state board to act. We're actually implementing pilot projects to implement the project right now. We've actually spent money and helped fund some preliminary pilot projects with self-help to look at what can we do for helping disadvantaged communities. And we're working again to work on individual pilot projects to implement the program right now, even before it's been adopted. And I think this idea of the power of these groups getting together in a room and understanding each other's interests. And we've got a basin plan amendment that has not been adopted by the state board. It's not in effect. And people are spending time and resources to implement it right now because we know we got to get it done. That's remarkable. I mean, we're fighting actually to try and get increased regulations put on us that's going to require us to spend money to implement projects to fix the drinking water problem and advocating on behalf of it, not against it. That's way different than any model I'd ever seen outside of the stakeholder process. So I think the power there, we're implementing right now our next steps on salts, much larger long-term problem. We're going to be looking, and there was a meeting yesterday in Sacramento in which we're trying to come up with a plan to figure out how do we balance salts in the Central Valley. And one of my key points in this is that we need to have a holistic approach. We can't look at it just in one region or another. We've got to look at it Central Valley-wide, figure out how the impacts in one area impact the other, and have all of these programs stitched together in a way that's cohesive and actually solves the problem for everybody and doesn't make it worse for others. So we're working on it. We're going to get it done. We need some help from the state board to get it approved and get it done quickly so we don't lose our momentum.
Talking about stitching it together, then the next question is, at the same time, we're going through this parallel process under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and we're trying to retain sustainability and have identified groundwater recharge as one of the tools. Do you see any conflict there with the processes, or what do we need to do to make sure that they can work in concert with each other? Is there a problem there?
There are definitely conflicts. When you look at water supply issues and water quality issues, there's inherent conflicts there. And one of the things I think we got to look at when we're setting policy is we got to acknowledge those conflicts up front and balance those interests ahead of time and not look at this in silos and look at sort of water supply issues and water quality issues. One of the things that I learned from working with the wastewater treatment folks in CV salts that they face is when you implement strict conservation measures within an urban setting, their wastewater effluent gets significantly more concentrated. The water quality regulations wherever they're discharging, whether you're discharging to groundwater or to surface waters, they don't get changed as a result of that. You got to figure out how does that water supply, we talked in the last panel, they talked about managing demand. Well, there's water quality impacts to having less water flow through a household, higher concentrations of salts, nitrates, other constituents going out the other end. We've got to balance those, and the same thing with recharge. We're trying to keep nitrates in the root zone, but we're also trying to push water down and recharge aquifers. We're going to have to be smart. Do I have the answer to that? No, but it's certainly a problem, and we got to sit down in a room and figure that out holistically in a way that I know we can solve the problem, but it's going to take a lot of work and effort.
Thank you. Anya, you represent the dairy industry, and I know that's a particular challenge for them, whether it's location in terms of they may be in recharge areas, or especially the nitrogen management part of it. What are your members doing and talking about, and how are they engaging in this process, and where are we?
Well, thanks everyone for having me here, and thank you for that question, Sarge. It's always hard to have a flashlight shown directly on maybe some of the harder things as part of our industry. And we now have a spotlight on us, and it's time that we step up to the plate and as a community try to address some of these challenges. And our board, particularly the Board of Western United Dairymen that represents quite a few dairy families in the state, has decided that they want to be part of the community solution. And so as we approach this is not just drinking water, this is not just ag water, it's not environmental water, it's water for food consumption and water for everyone to make sure we have certainty for the survival of our state. And that's a part of the solution we want to step up to. And so what we've looked at is, obviously we have some very technical challenge with too much manure. We have an issue with that. That's something we can talk about a little later. But as we approach both the short-term and the long-term solutions, we have to provide certainty to the communities that we live and work in. That includes certainties to the dairy farmers and certainty to those that we work with. And as we look at that, making sure that they have safe and affordable drinking water immediately has become the top priority of my board. And as we look forward into the future, I've got some really talented people up here that have been looking at CV salts. That is a regulatory pathway for relief that we certainly hope will work in conjunction with SGMA and work in conjunction with recharge efforts. In fact, I know it will. So this is an exciting time. The current legislation that is afoot, although there are some other proposals, our legislation, the Saving Affordable Drinking Water Act, is backed not just by this governor, but by the governor before him. And that's an exciting point of difference. And so we're looking forward to the policy opportunities to make sure that this is a much more collaborative effort.
Are there any technological solutions that the dairy industry sees, or what support do they need to help find some of those and be more successful that way?
There's many things that are right now in, I would say, beta phase testing. There are some opportunities to export our manure. We are running into a very practical challenge. Not a whole lot of people in the valley want more nitrogen, right? So this is a logistical problem. We have a need to get rid of a lot of that. But there are some new technologies as we land apply a lot of our manure that are coming forward to extract some of those harder nutrients. So that's exciting. I do need time though, and that's something that we emphasize to a lot of the policymakers whenever we can, that this is not an overnight solution, but I think in about 5 or 10 years, we're going to have a lot of progress made.
I think we've identified a common thread, and that's the glide path approach. We're going to have to understand it's going to take some time to get some of these things done, and that leads well into what Helen is working on. She's one of the people researching on how do we do groundwater recharge to both accomplish both of these goals that we talked about, to get more water into the ground, yet not drag in extra nitrate. So why don't you give us an update on what you have found and where we are, and where do we need to go?
Hello? Okay, here we go. Thank you very much for having me here today. Yeah, I should say up front that most of my research is really focused on agricultural groundwater banking, or FLADMAR, or AGMAR, as some people call it. I would say we're just at the very beginning of understanding how groundwater recharge is impacting potentially or affecting groundwater quality. But I think we can learn a lot from other studies, other water quality studies that have been conducted in the past, not necessarily in the context of MAR, Managed Aquifer Recharge, but that have looked into the links between agricultural management and groundwater quality. We have, for example, the nitrate report that Thomas Harder and others have put together in 2012. From that one, we definitely know that agricultural fertilizer and animal waste applied to farmland is the main source of nitrate in groundwater. The report has also identified that nitrate conditions or nitrate contamination in groundwater will likely worsen in the coming decades. More recently, Thomas has actually identified in a study that whatever nitrate we see in drinking water wells today has been applied at the land surface about 30 years ago. And that is only nitrate that has moved from infiltration of either irrigation water or natural precipitation. So there is some understanding how nitrate is moving into the groundwater along those time scales. Now, if we apply recharge or surface water on farmland to replenish groundwater, we're talking often about much larger volumes of water than we typically apply as a result of irrigation. And we have a couple site studies where we have some insight into how that is impacting nitrate leaching to the groundwater. So we have, for example, the studies conducted at Terra Nova Ranch in collaboration with Don Cameron, Sustainable Conservation, and Phil Bichon from Bichon and Associates. They continuously flooded about 1,000 acres, applied around 6,000 acre-feet of water, and they had average infiltration rates about 2.5 inches per day, and estimated based on the residual salt and nitrate content in the root zone that about 40 acre-feet per acre of recharge would be needed to just move all the salt out of the unsaturated zone, and an additional 40 acre-feet per acre would be needed to bring groundwater nitrate and salt levels back to the baseline before the recharge was applied. We have studies that have been conducted in the Pajo Valley, not necessarily as on-farm recharge, but the group of Andy Fisher from UC Santa Cruz is studying nitrate removal in an infiltration basin. And they have tested applying additional sources of carbon to the soil, and that has really increased the denitrification, so the removal of nitrate, tenfold as a result of just adding as a carbon source, which can help tracking some of the very soluble nitrate. From our own studies, we have found nitrate leaching is very soil type dependent, and it very much depends also on the frequency at which we are applying water for groundwater recharge. So we have done studies in collaboration with the California Almond Board on 2 almond orchards. One had a very sandy soil, the other one a fine sandy loam. The sandy soil, we saw about 82% removal of the nitrate in the root zone. So just applying 2 feet of water for groundwater recharge removed 82% of the nitrate in the root zone. In the fine sandy loam, we actually saw an increase in the nitrate after the recharge of about 167%. And so we investigated that process a little bit more in detail, and what we found is that adding that recharge water provided the necessary moisture to reach or to bring or to activate some of the soil microbial communities. So we actually saw nitrate generated by mineralization of organic nitrogen. And but the good news on that one is we tested 2 different treatments. So if we actually apply recharge more frequently and don't wait like a week or 2 between these events, you can actually move water quicker through the root zone, and the microbial communities cannot keep up with the mineralization. So there is a pretty complex system that we need to study, and it's very site-specific. So we can't necessarily say there's a one-for-all solution.
Interesting. Okay, so then let's move to our lightning round then. I'm going to have to see if you've got something high priority and ask, what is it that you think in terms of high priority right now that would help in terms of where you're coming from? So good example, Helen, I'm going to go to you first. What is it that you would have as an ask to help move this along a little faster? What additional work do we need to do? Because obviously we want to move groundwater recharge faster. This is probably going to be an opportunity year. What can we do this year without jeopardizing ourselves, for example, with putting a whole lot of nitrate in the ground?
Yeah, so far we really would appreciate more pilot projects, just because it's really, we have to first understand the mechanisms, and it's, as already mentioned, it's a complex system, depends on soil type, it depends on soil carbon and soil microbial communities. So having landowners work with us who are willing to support some of that research and go not just like, and not just look at the land surface, but really study the whole system, the unsaturated zone and the groundwater underneath. That would be pretty helpful. But in general, I think my advice for now would be don't spread a little bit water everywhere. Try to focus on identifying these really good recharge locations, and then try to figure out a system to protect the nutrient, the residual nutrients that we have in those sites, and really carefully manage the nutrients that are applied every year in order to minimize the load that could potentially be leached to the groundwater.
Thank you. I also heard another common element. Rick Ortega talked about it in the last panel, and that is we need more pilots. We need to have these things tried out in a number of places, and so we're going to offer that in this panel as well, pilot projects to keep things moving along. Anya, what would be your highest priority?
Our highest priority is to ensure certainty for our communities. We must pass a safe and affordable drinking water fee statewide, that spreads the burden around between communities, between stakeholders, and it doesn't put blame on any one sector of our state. And that's our top priority, because after that's achieved, we can make sure that our communities are healthy, our dairies are healthy, and that we can continue with some of these longer funding sources for exporting our manure and making sure that we have a long-term plan.
Sounds good. Veronica, what's yours?
Well, Anya just pointed to the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. This shouldn't be a political issue. This is about fulfilling the human right to water in California, which the state declared 6 years ago. It's time to get it done. We shouldn't keep looking the other way and allowing this to continue in 2019 and beyond 2019. So I encourage everyone to support the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, talk to your representatives, reach out to our governor. There's a broad coalition supporting this effort, and I invite you all to join us. And since Anya talked about it, I'll add one more thing, which is as GSAs are on their way to developing draft groundwater sustainability plans, make sure that you're engaging those voices that are most vulnerable to water scarcity and drinking water contamination.
David, what's your highest priority?
I'm going to put my voice in with the two of them in terms of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund is really essential, not just for disadvantaged communities and those that are impacted, but for the regulated community as well. We need to have that bill and have a funding source. It's going to take capital improvements, but it's also going to take O&M. This fills that O&M gap. Agriculture, other industries, all of us are wastewater treatment plants, and we all produce nitrates one way or another. We're all going to be paying for this. Having it an organized, systematic way to get that done is essential. The other issue, I would hope that moving forward, when we're looking at broad policy issues related to water supply, SGMA, or other broader state water quality issues or water supply issues, we look at the water quality impacts of that. And one of the things that I think it's hard to sit up on a stage and rally against conservation, but I'm going to do that today. It's not always nirvana. I mean, there are water quality impacts to conservation, and the wastewater treatment plants pointed that out to us. I worry about, you look at Northern California, and they have plentiful water supply there, and they have conjunctive use of their water with surface water supplies. They have very good salinity issues up there, very few nitrate issues. If part of our water supply policy is to curtail application of that water on the surface of the land in Northern California, what is going to happen to water quality? There's a whole lot of things that flow down from that, and we've got to look long term. Right now, a lot of the things we deal with in CV salts, and I see in front of the regional board that Carl struggles with, and the regional board staff and board members struggle with decisions that were made 20, 30, 40 years ago, that they didn't understand the implications of that in today's society. And we're unwilling to change them because we're so entrenched in our positions. We can't look at changing the municipal, certain policies. So we've got to be open-minded, look broad scale and holistically at these things.
So we now have a fairly consistent recommendation. So that leads me to ask the question, what is in the proposed act right now? You're obviously advocating that it get adopted, but what are some of the basic elements? And I'll invite any of you to pop in and talk about it so that people understand what does it mean. What is the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act besides creating the fund? What does it offer?
Well, the primary pieces of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water are, they revolve around a de minimis 95-cent fee that would go into a pot of money. Approximately $110 million comes from that fee. There's a different fee for industrial users. Approximately $30 million comes from agriculture to handle the primary needs for O&M and establish a safe and affordable drinking water fund to provide direct potable drinking water to disadvantaged communities and those that need it. There's also several inclusions in there at the moment for liability protection from growers and dairies associated with their immediate contamination issues. This is a issue that is contentious, and but that's why we're here together as a coalition.
I'd add to that the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund doesn't seek to just address the nitrate issues. We know that communities throughout the state are impacted by other contaminants like arsenic, disinfectant byproducts, TCP, beyond nitrate. So the fund seeks to address all contaminants and make sure that that's why there's two revenue mechanisms from the dairy and ag industry and then the water user fee to make sure that we are providing the resources to address all sources of contamination in California.
The other constituent, I mean, there's also salts there are many communities that are impacted by salts, and that fund can be utilized for salts. And the Drinking Water Fund actually fits very well with the CV Salts initiative, in that we need long-term funding to implement the projects that we're going to need to develop locally for nitrate management plans, for nitrate control, and addressing the drinking water needs there. So from the ag's perspective, agriculture, all of ag's going to have a nitrogen fertilizer tax, basically. So everybody's going to pay into that. But there are benefits long-term for everybody across the state in addressing this problem and letting us focus on sort of the things, the next step. Until we focus on this, we really can't move forward. We have to address this now, and I think getting this done takes care of a big step.
So we have in the report made the concept of providing clean drinking water to all San Joaquin Valley citizens a very important component of that, but there are other people in parts of the state, in particular both the association and California water agencies and the urban agencies, that weren't very happy with this proposal. How do you respond to their concerns in getting this adopted? Because it failed the last time. What makes it different this time in terms of how we can get this done? And how do we convince them that this is important enough for all of us to get together on it?
Can I take that?
Yes, go ahead, Anya.
This is not a new proposal. This proposal has been around for a very long time at this point. The goal is to provide clean drinking water to people that don't have it. And so anything that deviates from that goal should be questioned. The concept supported by the opposition to this bill does not provide enough money, particularly as seed money, to fix the problem. It's also not the political popular concept in the Capitol. You have to make sure your policy matches your politics, because if it doesn't, you're not going to achieve victory. So in this case, it's very clinical. The answer is in collaboration and coalition.
This proposal didn't, it didn't happen in the dark of night. This is a bill and a legislative proposal more than a decade in the making that has involved various stakeholders, that does include reaching out to various parties to identify a solution that we can all agree to and we can work with, and will lead to a permanent source of funding. That's what the key is here. What opposition has put on the table does not provide that certainty that there will be a permanent source of funding, and that there's a lot of economic uncertainty associated with what's being proposed, which creates a significant problem. And what we don't want to see is a half-baked solution that gets us maybe a few steps down the road, but we're back at the same problem a few years from now. And what we should be doing is focusing on what Anya just said, is collaboration. And there are multiple proposals. There's a Senate bill by Senator Manning. On the Assembly side, Assemblymember Garcia has introduced a bill, and the governor has put out his budget proposal as well as a trailer bill. So there's opportunity now to work together and work with opposition and others to identify the solution. But again, what's key is we need a permanent source of funding to address ongoing operation and maintenance costs of treating contamination, in addition to capital improvements.
Shifting again a little bit to long-term, Helen, one of the things that's obviously come out of this is that we need the long-term funding, mostly perhaps for, in my estimation, for O&M, because I understand, and perhaps you can shed some light on the fact that in many cases, nitrates, if we do a good job in the future, may not be quite as significant an issue. Can you back that up, that eventually at least that portion of the contamination problem could possibly be technically addressed?
Yeah, groundwater modeling so far has shown as long as your groundwater basin is connected to the ocean, you theoretically have a chance to flush out any excess salts and nitrate out to the ocean. The only exception for now, I would say, is the Tulare Lake Basin. We consider that basin a semi-closed basin, so any water that is actually entering the basin right now has no exit, not at least to the San Joaquin River and then to the delta. So management of nutrients in that basin are really a pressing issue, because even if you add low contaminant snowmelt or rainfall runoff water into the basin, you're still just adding loading. Yeah, you just load more salts and nitrate into the basin effectively. And the other issue is that we are using a lot of groundwater in that basin, so we're just recycling and up concentrate some of the nutrients we have. But with clean recharge, we envision that there is definitely a possibility to dilute many of the nitrate issues we have.
David.
We looked at that a little bit in CV salts, and I mean, the time scale to actually see those impacts in groundwater quality is decades. We looked at a what's called sort of an extreme scenario in which we looked at a small area within the Alta Irrigation District, and we just assumed that you would cease all inputs of nitrogen in that area. And I don't even think we've factored in what nitrogen there's already in the Vados zone. She talked about how there's, the nitrate that's in there now is 30 years ago was put in. But if we stopped all irrigation, all inputs of nitrogen in this one local area, and you actually put wells down and you pumped the water up, you treated it for nitrates and you injected it back into the aquifer, it was, I think, between 50 and 75 years before you could actually restore that aquifer. I mean, this is a project that is not implementable, not economically sustainable. And with that degree of effort, we're talking over 50 years to restore that basin. So it's not a short-term problem. I don't think that we can expect the disadvantaged communities to wait for 50 years for water. This is a systemic problem long-term, and it's not just nitrates as well. There's arsenic, there's salts. So that's why it takes a broad-based economic support to address this issue and to get it done now. And I think those who don't see that and don't come to the table with a genuine solutions are not doing the state a service. This is a societal problem. We can pull together and solve it. We just got to get it done and not just try and kick the can down the road.
We've got to get it done. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready for the Q&A. Here we go. This is gentleman right over here.
Who was first if you want? Okay, all right. Here. All right. I think this is probably more for Helen than anybody. The Kings River Water Quality Coalition has done some pilot studies in the Alta Irrigation District. The isotope study we've done, and subsequent now we've got a looking for anthropogenic items in the water on the same wells we sampled. 45% of the wells showed up with anthropogenic stuff in them. So that's starting to question what's the source of the nitrogen. So we have a main problem with identifying quantities of sources. That's a toughie. It's going to be happening. Then within the North Kings GSA, which is Fresno Irrigation District and Metropolitan Fresno Clovis, the part where I'm going here is, I think in the future, nitrogen may not be the main problem we have. It's going to be the uraniums, the arsenics, the chrome-6. Kerman went down 2,000 feet and had chrome-6 all the way down in their municipal wells. If you go to Easton, south of Fresno, unincorporated area, they've got high uranium in parts of those wells, but not all. So it may be that the nitrogen becomes a small problem in the future compared to some of these others. And see what you say about that.
Yeah, as David also pointed out, I mean, we have many other contaminants we have to worry about. And actually, if we do recharge, then we have two competing contaminants, nitrate and arsenic, for example. So for denitrification, we would prefer saturated anoxic conditions in the root zone or in the unsaturated zone. However, having prolonged anoxic conditions definitely helps dissolving some of the arsenic that might be bound to the sediment that has been deposited over many thousands of years. And so you actually can mobilize that one and dissolve it bring it back into the groundwater, and then potentially pump that up with drinking water wells. So I mean, that's just like, you know, one pair of contaminants. And I think nevertheless, working on the nitrate issue is pressing just because of the health implications. Hopefully in the coming decades, we will have technology available at an economic cost that's affordable to then really think about treating drinking water at the source.
Can I add one thing in just in terms of the question of the sources of nitrogen? The farmers in the room and those involved in agriculture, from a regulatory perspective and the regulatory challenge we face, it does not matter at this point where that nitrogen came from. The regulatory box that the regional board is in, if the nitrates are above 10, they can't allow nitrogen to leach past the root zone above 10, and it doesn't matter where it came from. That finger pointing is sort of irrelevant to getting out of the regulatory box. So just keep that in mind. It's important to figure out source control in the future and looking toward that, but we need to realize this regulatory challenge is irrelevant of who caused it.
So, so it's confusing for people just sitting here listening to who don't understand. There's 2.5 million acre feet. Tulare Lake would hold 2.5 million acre feet of water. No dam required. Why can't that be used as a storage facility? And you have Westland sitting over here saying they're on Cortland clay. Well, Tulare Basin's on Cortland clay. And they're talking about popping through the Cortland clay and pushing the water down through. Well, we have a spot where we can store 2.5 million acre feet of water without a dam. Why can't we figure out a way scientifically, Sarge, to utilize that water? And sorry to point you out, brother, but utilize that water and come up with greater minds than we have that can tell us that just having the storage facility there without the requirement of a dam, just that savings alone in infrastructure is a valuable resource that we're utilizing.
Well, I'd like you to go in front of me, Keith, when we go talk to the Boswell Company about that particular concept. We're gonna do very well. And that has come often up as a possibility and a subject. In fact, they already do that. Part of the basin down there, they use it themselves in wet years for storage of water, and then they lift it into the aqueduct and market some of that water. So it is a possibility, but I don't have any numbers to tell you how much it's going to cost to buy that out. You have to talk about the loss of the agricultural productivity over a long period of time, right? And turning that over in the economy and all those kinds of things to try and value what it would take to reconvert that back. Having said that, that's exactly some of the piloting and things that we're probably talking about. If you look in our report, did we identify 22,000 acres potentially for that could be used for various purposes? Ellen, we need to get in the details of the report, but those concepts are there. It then becomes the economics.
To what extent can managing the valley's rangelands and ag lands for organic content and biological diversity or health help mitigate nutrient problems like nitrogen or phosphate, either in the groundwater or surface water runoff?
Well, we definitely included watershed management, and I'll defer to my panel in terms of if they've got anything to add. There's ancillary work probably in the beef industry to the dairy industry in terms of how to manage those types of lands. We've got some other experts here, Soapy's here, You know, that's a good question. I think it fits in the overall package of watershed management, trying to hang on to the soil particles and hang on to the nutrients that naturally recycle in those systems. So that's got to be part of the big picture that we identified as forest and upper watershed management.
As part of the forest fuels reduction process, the beef industry and UC Davis have a wonderful set of new pilot projects that you should be able to see the results on by the end of the year that answers some of that question.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. One of them is rhetorical, so you get off on that one. But is there any blue baby syndrome in California? I remember that was what started the whole nitrogen, and I've never heard of that actually happening. Secondly, Terry Tamminen, who was the secretary of, help me here, of the California EPA under Schwarzenegger, came out with the report that the LA basin could be entirely self-sufficient on the water the precipitation that it receives currently if it's managed better. And I've seen farms lose acreage due to water. I haven't heard of any golf courses going out of business in Los Angeles. And thirdly, what is the difference between justice and environmental, social, or economic justice?
I don't know if that was the question for this panel or that's.
I'll attempt to answer the last question anyway.
Yeah.
And one of the things that points I kind of wanted to make, and thank you for giving me the door to open the door for me to make it. I think when we look at environmental justice, we've got to look more broadly than just California or just our local community. We've got to look sort of globally, really, at this. I mean, one of the things that I worry about with dairy, when I work with dairy and in their issues, is that basically what we're going to do in California is we're going to push dairy out of California. It's going to make no sense for them to raise dairy cows in California anymore. So what's going to happen? They're going to go someplace else. They're going to either go to another state. As soon as we're going to continue to eat dairy products and consume dairy products, we're going to get our dairy products somewhere else. So what we've done is we've exported those externalities to another state or to another country who can't deal with them, or even less able to deal with them than we are. So when we look at this, we got to look at the global environmental justice of this and figure out, look, what we're asking dairy to do, is it economically sustainable? We're not solving the environmental justice problem by just kicking them out of the state. So we need to look globally at how do we do that and how do we do it in a way that's sustainable.
And as to the question about blue baby syndrome, it'd take a whole day to go through the process, and I think you know this, Donna, how we establish drinking water standards. But it's one of those risk areas where it's an involuntary risk. We all make decisions every day about doing some things, and those are voluntary risks, whether it's driving a car or other things. But involuntary risks are a lot more difficult and result in a lot more conservative numbers in any arena that you're dealing with involuntary risk. So the reason for the 10 is the way they do a whole bunch of calculations that we don't have time to talk about, and that's why we don't see blue baby syndrome. So you need to get deeper into the development of drinking water regulations to understand it. Anybody else?
I don't want to wait until there's another case of blue baby syndrome.
Anybody else?
If I could have one more. And first of all, I appreciate what everybody has said this morning, and I've learned a lot from it. I wanted to ask a question. Actually, it kind of relates to the dairy issue, and so it's probably more addressed to Anja and to Helen. Earlier it was mentioned about holistic approaches and removal of methane in the air quality and greenhouse gas side of things. There are more digesters being put in for dairies in the valley, and we think that's a great thing to help with greenhouse gases. Is there a way to combine those efforts to remove nitrates so that that effluent may go one step further, can help with our groundwater quality?
Maybe. Digesters alone do not solve the quality of water problem. They don't, or water quality. They don't even touch it. So there's 3 buckets: methane, air quality, and water quality. Digesters solve one of those issues. There are a host of new technologies and new funding opportunities that the dairy industry is currently taking advantage to solve 2 out of 3 of those problems at a time. And there is some new experimental technology that comes with digesters that is, again, in beta testing that will hopefully solve some of the nitrate issue on the back end, flow meters. So we're looking at it, but to your point, I couldn't have said it better. This is an economic crossroads for the dairy industry right now. I won't bore you with the dairy pricing and milk economics that go along with that. But as price takers, we receive a formula from the federal government. We don't have a lot of room to absorb some of these regulatory costs. So we are now working with our dairymen to try to achieve at least 2 of those 3 objectives with every piece of incentive funding that we're doing. Because I don't want to come back to them in 5 years and say, oh yeah, by the way, you got to fix this too. I wouldn't be very popular.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi. So water quality is, of course, very important and it's a high priority for everybody, but we also can't sit here and act like this is necessarily a new priority. There are already programs in place, CV salts, nitrogen management plans that are managed by coalitions that are already here, and people are already paying into these funds. So my question is, why can't we use those funds more effectively to reach our end goal of clean and safe drinking water, rather than going back to the growers who are already paying hand over fist for this, or turning our autonomous districts into state tax collectors for projects that may or may not ever benefit their areas?
I'll do that. CV salts doesn't have a funding mechanism. There's a regulatory requirement in there that we implement certain projects, and so it will fall on agriculture and all wastewater treatment plants, everybody in terms of the nitrate control program anyway. It's going to fall on those industries, all of them, to collectively figure out how to fund this thing. And really, as we talked about, the problem is not just nitrates. A lot of the issues have arsenic and other things. And so one thing that I think is unfair is for those who discharge nitrate to be burdened with all the groundwater quality problems in the Central Valley. And that's why the broader fund makes sense, because we can solve all of those problems together. And I think one of the things that we came out of CV salts is having a stakeholder process, and I think we talked about it early on in the introduction, the power of that stakeholder process, that we need to get together and understand each other's issues, understand how we can solve them collectively. We're going to all give up something. It's not easy. It's incredibly painful. I mean, and frankly, just boring at times, right? But you got to go through that, and when you come out of it, you get a product that people can stand behind. And look what you have right here. I mean, our advocacy for the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund came out of CV salts. And so we're collectively working toward a goal, and we understand each other's issues. I can speak for dairy, they can speak for ag, we can speak for the EJ communities, and that's what comes out of the stakeholder process. So I think one of the take-homes I'd like to see is that we, as painful as it is, we gotta harness the energy and the knowledge we have and sit down in a room, work together, and work out these problems, whether it's water supply, water quality. We can get it done.
Well, the other thing on the funding source and why there's a need is that there is no single source of funding in the state today that'll pay for ongoing operation and maintenance costs of treating contamination in drinking water. There are obviously state revolving funds, state dollars, other programs, local programs and discretionary dollars like CDBG, USDA funding, but not one of those funding sources would allow disadvantaged communities or provide resources to treat ongoing operation and maintenance costs, and that is one big goal of the coalition that's coalesced around the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund today.
How many people here produce food and fiber? Well, I commend you for coming, because you are the change agents. And even though you may not agree with everything that's going on, being here is to be commended, because it's a step in the right direction. And I applaud the people that make food and fiber every day. So thank you for being here, all of you.
Well, that concludes this session, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to thank the panel, and please give them a good hand.